Right now, there's a man in your life who's pulling away, becoming distant, sending mixed signals, and your first instinct is to chase harder, text more, give more of yourself, prove your worth. But what if I told you that the very act of chasing is the reason he's running, and that the moment you stop pursuing him, everything changes in ways that Sigmund Freud predicted over a century ago? The father of psychoanalysis discovered something profound about human desire that most women never learn. We unconsciously destroy what we desperately want by making it too easy to obtain. And today, I'm going to show you exactly what happens in his unconscious mind when you finally stop chasing and start honoring your own psychological power. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your withdrawal will do more to attract him than all your pursuing ever could. And more importantly, you'll discover how to break free from the unconscious patterns that have been sabotaging your love life since childhood. Deep in your unconscious mind lives a primitive drive that Sigmund Freud called the pleasure principle, a force that compels you to seek immediate satisfaction and avoid pain at all costs. When a man pulls away or becomes distant, this ancient part of your psyche interprets his withdrawal as a threat to your pleasure and security, triggering an almost automatic response to chase and regain what feels like it's slipping away. Your rational mind might tell you to walk away, but your unconscious is screaming that you must pursue, must fix, must win back what you're losing, because losing feels like a wound to your very sense of self. This chasing behavior isn't really about the man himself. It's about what Freud discovered through years of analyzing patients, the compulsion to repeat patterns that feel familiar even when they cause us pain. Your unconscious mind recognizes the chase because it mirrors something from your past. Perhaps the way you had to work for love or attention as a child, and now it feels normal, even necessary, to prove your worth through pursuit. The more he pulls away, the more your unconscious believes you must try harder, give more, chase longer, because somewhere deep inside you learned that love requires effort and suffering. But here's what Freud understood about human psychology, that most women never realize. The very act of chasing activates a psychological dynamic where you unconsciously position yourself as less valuable than what you're pursuing. Your unconscious mind begins to believe that if you have to chase something, it must be more worthy than you are, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where you diminish your own power while elevating his. This unconscious devaluation of yourself becomes the foundation for an unhealthy dynamic where your worth becomes tied to whether or not you can successfully capture and keep his attention. Freud's groundbreaking work revealed that human desire operates on a fundamental principle. We are unconsciously programmed to want what we cannot easily possess and to lose interest in what comes too readily to us. When you chase a man, you're essentially making yourself too available, too predictable, too easy to obtain, which triggers his unconscious mind to categorize you as something he already has rather than something he desires. His primitive brain, operating from the same pleasure principle that drives your need to chase, begins to seek novelty and challenge elsewhere, because what is easily obtained loses its psychological value in the unconscious marketplace of desire. The male psyche, according to Freudian analysis, is particularly susceptible to what psychologists call the scarcity principle, where absence and unavailability actually increase perceived value and desirability. When you stop chasing, you create a psychological void that his unconscious mind feels compelled to fill, not because he consciously decides to pursue you, but because his primitive brain interprets your withdrawal as a loss of something valuable. This shift happens beneath his conscious awareness, in the deep waters of the unconscious where desire is born and nurtured through mystery, challenge, and the tantalizing possibility of conquest. Your withdrawal activates what Freud called the reality principle in his mind, forcing him to confront the actual possibility of losing you rather than taking your presence for granted. Suddenly, his unconscious begins to work on your behalf, creating fantasies about you, wondering what you're doing, who you're with, and why you're no longer readily available to soothe his ego and validate his desirability. The psychological tension between wanting what he cannot have and the comfort of what was always available creates an internal conflict that often resolves itself through renewed pursuit of what now seems precious because it might be lost. Within, your psyche lives what Freud called the remnants of your psychosexual development, the inner child who learned early lessons about love, abandonment, and what it takes to keep people close. This inner child carries wounds from moments when love felt conditional, when attention had to be earned, or when important people in your life withdrew their affection as punishment or control. When a man starts to pull away, it's not just your adult self responding. It's this wounded inner child who panics at the familiar sensation of being left behind, triggering an almost desperate need to chase and cling to prevent the abandonment. That feels like emotional death. Your unconscious mind doesn't distinguish between past and present when it comes to emotional threats. So the fear of losing this man becomes entangled with every previous experience of loss, rejection, or abandonment you've ever felt. Freud discovered that these early experiences create what he called fixations, psychological stuck points, where we unconsciously recreate the same dynamics, hoping for a different outcome, hoping this time will be enough to make someone stay. The chasing becomes a compulsive attempt to heal old wounds by proving you can make this person love you the way you needed to be loved long ago. But here's the profound shift that happens when you stop chasing. You give your inner child the gift of self-respect and boundaries that she never learned were possible. Instead of repeating the old pattern of frantically trying to prevent abandonment, you demonstrate to your unconscious mind that you are valuable enough to walk away from situations that don't honor your worth. This act of self-preservation actually begins to heal those ancient wounds, because you're finally providing for yourself the protection and dignity that your inner child always needed, but never received. Freud's structural theory of the psyche reveals three forces constantly at war within us: the id that wants immediate gratification, the superego that judges and criticizes, and the ego that tries to balance both while navigating reality. When you chase a man, your id is desperately seeking the pleasure of his attention, while your superego punishes you with thoughts of not being good enough, leaving your ego scrambling to find strategies to win him over. This internal chaos puts you in a weakened psychological position where you're operating from scarcity and fear rather than abundance and strength, essentially handing over your power to someone who hasn't earned it. The moment you stop chasing, something profound happens. In the unconscious power structure between you and him, your ego finally gets space to breathe and assess the situation rationally. Your id stops being consumed with the anxiety of pursuit, and even your superego begins to quiet its harsh criticisms because you're no longer engaging in behavior that diminishes your self-worth. This internal shift creates what Freud would recognize as psychological integration, where all parts of your psyche align in self-respect rather than self-abandonment, and this alignment radiates an energy that others unconsciously perceive as strength and desirability. His unconscious mind immediately registers this shift in your psychological position because humans are wired to detect changes in power dynamics even when we're not consciously aware of them. Where once you were the one seeking validation and approval, positioning yourself as the less valuable party in the dynamic, you now occupy the space of someone who has something valuable to offer but doesn't need his acceptance to feel worthy. This reversal triggers his unconscious recognition that he may have misjudged your value, and suddenly he finds himself in the unfamiliar position of wondering if he's worthy of your attention, rather than assuming you should be grateful for his. When you're caught in the cycle of chasing a man, your unconscious mind activates what Freud called defense mechanisms, psychological strategies designed to protect your ego from the painful reality that your pursuit isn't working. Rationalization becomes your best friend as you convince yourself that his mixed signals mean he's just scared of how much he cares, that his hot and cold behavior is evidence of his deep feelings rather than his lack of genuine interest. You tell yourself stories about timing, his past relationships, his fear of commitment, anything to avoid facing the truth that someone who wanted to be with you would make it clear and consistent. Projection is another defense mechanism that kicks into overdrive when you're chasing someone unavailable. You project your own feelings, intentions, and desires onto him, assuming that because you feel a deep connection, he must feel it too, that because you're thinking about him constantly, he must be thinking about you just as much. Freud understood that projection allows us to avoid the painful reality of unrequited feelings by creating a fantasy where the other person shares our emotional experience, even when their actions clearly demonstrate otherwise. Perhaps the most damaging defense mechanism you employ while chasing is denial, where you unconsciously refuse to acknowledge the clear signs that this person is not emotionally available or genuinely interested in building something real with you. You focus on the occasional sweet text, the rare moment of attention, the brief glimpse of what could be, while your unconscious blocks out the larger pattern of inconsistency, unavailability, and emotional distance. When you stop chasing, these defense mechanisms begin to dissolve, allowing you to see the situation clearly for the first time and recognize that your energy has been invested in protecting yourself from truth rather than pursuing actual love. Freud's revolutionary discovery of transference reveals how we unconsciously transfer feelings, expectations, and unresolved conflicts from past relationships onto current ones. And nowhere is this more powerful than in the way women relate to emotionally unavailable men. If your father was distant, critical, or inconsistent with his love and attention, your unconscious mind has been programmed to associate that familiar pattern of withholding with love itself, making you unconsciously attracted to men who recreate the same dynamic of having to work for affection. The chase becomes an attempt to finally win the love that felt conditional or impossible to secure in your earliest and most formative relationship with masculine energy. Your unconscious doesn't just transfer the wound, it transfers the hope that this time will be different, that through your persistence, your love, your dedication, you can finally crack the code of the unavailable man and prove yourself worthy of consistent love and attention. This is why you find yourself drawn to men who remind you unconsciously of your father, not necessarily in appearance or obvious traits, but in their emotional patterns, their way of making you feel like you have to earn their approval, their tendency to be present one moment and distant the next. The familiar pain feels like coming home, even as it destroys your peace and self-worth. When you stop chasing, you break the transference cycle that has been running your romantic life from the shadows of your unconscious mind. Instead of trying to heal your father wound through this man, you begin to recognize that no romantic partner can go back in time and give you the consistent, unconditional love you needed as a child from your primary masculine figure. This recognition frees you from the compulsive need to pursue unavailable men, because you're no longer unconsciously trying to rewrite your origin story through them, allowing you to choose partners based on who they actually are, rather than what unfinished business they represent from your past. Freud's theories on female psychosexual development, though controversial, reveals something profound about how women are conditioned to seek external validation for their worth and desirability. From childhood, girls are unconsciously taught that their value lies in being chosen, being wanted, being pursued by others, creating what Freud recognized as an external locus of self-worth, where your sense of feminine power becomes dependent on male attention and approval. When you chase a man, you're unconsciously operating from this conditioned belief that your desirability must be proven through his acceptance, that your feminine worth is only real when reflected back to you through his interest and desire. This deep-seated need for masculine validation creates what Freud would identify as a psychological dependency, where your sexual and romantic confidence becomes hostage to another person's reactions and responses to you. Your unconscious mind begins to interpret his withdrawal or disinterest as evidence that you're not desirable enough, not feminine enough, not worthy enough, sending you into a panic-driven pursuit to prove your value and restore your sense of sexual worth. The chase becomes less about genuine desire for connection and more about desperately trying to maintain your psychological sense of feminine identity through his validation. But when you stop chasing, something revolutionary happens in your relationship. With your own feminine power and sexuality, your unconscious mind begins to recognize that your desirability exists independent of any man's recognition or validation of it, that your feminine energy is a force unto itself rather than something that needs external confirmation to be real. This shift allows you to embody what Freud would recognize as integrated feminine power, where your sexuality and desirability become self-sourced rather than other-dependent, making you infinitely more attractive because you're no longer operating from the desperate energy of needing someone else to make you feel worthy of desire. Freud's understanding of the unconscious mind reveals that we assign value to things based on their availability, and when you suddenly withdraw your attention, energy, and pursuit from a man, you create what psychologists call scarcity in his unconscious perception of you. Where once you were readily available, always responding, always pursuing, always there to validate his ego and soothe his need for attention, your absence creates a void that his primitive brain interprets as the loss of something valuable. His unconscious doesn't rationalize your withdrawal. It simply registers that a source of pleasure and validation has become unavailable, triggering an automatic response to want what he can no longer easily access. This psychological scarcity principle operates beneath conscious awareness, meaning he doesn't consciously decide to want you more because you're less available. Rather, his unconscious mind begins to assign higher value to your attention precisely because it's no longer guaranteed or predictable. The texts that used to come regularly, the availability that he took for granted, the eager responses to his minimal efforts, all of these suddenly become precious commodities in his unconscious economy of desire because they're no longer abundant. Freud discovered that the human psyche is wired to pursue what feels threatened or lost, and your withdrawal activates this primitive psychological mechanism. Your absence doesn't just create scarcity, it forces his unconscious mind to confront the reality of losing you rather than the comfortable assumption that you'll always be there regardless of how he treats you. This confrontation with potential loss awakens what Freud called the reality principle, where his unconscious begins to calculate the actual cost of losing your presence, your energy, your attention, and your affection. Suddenly, the dynamic shifts from him being the prize you're trying to win to you being the valuable entity that he risks losing, creating a psychological urgency in his unconscious that often translates into the very pursuit that was absent when you were doing all the chasing. Freud's concept of repetition compulsion reveals one of the most devastating patterns in human psychology, our unconscious drive to recreate familiar situations, even when they cause us pain and suffering. In your romantic life, this shows up as an almost magnetic attraction to the same type of emotionally unavailable man, the same cycle of pursuit and rejection, the same pattern of giving your power away to someone who doesn't value it, because your unconscious mind finds comfort in what feels familiar even when it's destroying your happiness. This compulsion operates below conscious awareness, making you believe you're choosing different men when you're actually choosing different versions of the same psychological dynamic. Your unconscious mind clings to these painful patterns because they feel like home. They match the emotional blueprint that was created in your earliest relationships and stored in the deepest parts of your psyche. Breaking free from repetition compulsion requires more than just deciding to make better choices. It requires rewiring the unconscious programming that drives you toward what hurts you because it feels psychologically familiar. When you stop chasing this man, you're not just changing your behavior in this one relationship. You're interrupting a pattern that has been running your romantic life from the shadows, forcing your unconscious to confront the possibility of something different. The act of withdrawing your pursuit becomes what Freud would recognize as a therapeutic intervention in your own repetition compulsion, because you're consciously choosing to break the cycle rather than unconsciously perpetuating it. This conscious choice to stop chasing creates new neural pathways in your unconscious mind, teaching it that you can survive without recreating familiar pain, that you can choose your own worth over psychological familiarity. As this new pattern strengthens, you begin to unconsciously attract different types of people and situations because your internal programming has shifted from seeking familiar suffering to recognizing genuine love and availability. Freud revolutionized human understanding by showing us that we can observe our own unconscious patterns, bringing what was hidden in darkness into the light of conscious awareness, where it can be examined, understood, and ultimately transformed. When you step back from chasing and begin to analyze your own romantic patterns with the same objectivity that a psychoanalyst would bring to your case, you become both the patient and the therapist in your own healing journey. This self-analysis allows you to see how your unconscious mind has been running your love life, driving you toward the same types of people and situations while you believed you were making conscious choices. The process of becoming your own analyst requires what Freud called free association, allowing yourself to explore without judgment the deeper motivations, fears, and desires that drive your romantic choices. You begin to ask yourself the kinds of probing questions that reveal unconscious truth. Why are you attracted to men who are emotionally unavailable? What does their unavailability represent to your unconscious mind? How does the familiar pain of pursuit connect to your earliest experiences of love and rejection? This self-inquiry becomes a form of psychological archaeology, uncovering the buried beliefs and patterns that have been shaping your romantic destiny from the unconscious depths. As you develop this analytical perspective on your own love life, you gain what Freud considered the ultimate therapeutic tool, insight that leads to lasting change. You stop being the victim of your unconscious patterns and become the conscious creator of your romantic reality, choosing partners and situations based on clear-eyed assessment rather than unconscious compulsion. This transformation from unconscious reactor to conscious analyst of your own romantic patterns is perhaps the most powerful shift you can make, because it puts you in control of your love life for the first time, allowing you to write a new story based on self-awareness, rather than repeating the old story written by your unconscious wounds. So here's the question that will determine the entire trajectory of your romantic future. Are you ready to stop being the victim of your own unconscious patterns and become the conscious architect of the love you actually deserve? Or will you continue chasing men who can't see your value because you've forgotten it yourself? Freud showed us that awareness is the first step toward freedom. And now that you understand the psychological forces that have been driving your romantic choices from the shadows, you have the power to choose differently. If this resonates with your soul and you're ready to transform your love life from the inside out, subscribe to this channel because we're just getting started on this journey of psychological awakening and romantic empowerment.